EastEnders, one of Britain's most popular soaps, bizarrely linked to two horrific crimes.
To have two actresses from the same soap killed is a terrible, grisly coincidence.
Two of its stars taken too soon.
I remember Gemma as being a very bubbly, smiley, quite cheeky character.
Cyan was really chatty, friendly person, absolutely lovely, a fantastic mum.
The innocent victims of separate, deadly, real-life dramas.
This isn't television. This isn't a soap opera plot.
Who fell victim to the men closest to them.
If you did that in a soap, you would be worried that the viewers wouldn't believe such hideous, grotesque, evil treatment.
A devoted mother killed in her own home with her children.
The kids were everything, you know, and she put them first no matter what.
Their father on the run.
The alarm really started to sound when he too had disappeared. And now that becomes very suspicious.
A loving sister, her body dumped in a canal.
She was obviously a really family-orientated girl, you know, she was looking after her mum and actually being very loyal and devoted to her family.
Her brother desperately covering his tracks.
Here's him trying to mislead. He's hiding the body, concealment, and cleaning up the apartment.
Tonight, the detective who led the hunt for one of the murderers.
She sees an open suitcase and a human torso floating on it. And that's when this moved from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide investigation.
And speaking on television for the first time, the ex-wife of the man who murdered his soap star partner and their two kids.
I didn't believe he was a murderer. I said, no, that's not possible. I knew him, I was with him. How is this possible?
Cyan Blake and Gemma McCluskey, both former stars of one of Britain's best-loved soaps, EastEnders. As their characters, Frankie Pierre and Kerry Skinner, they made more than 90 appearances in Albert Square. But in a bizarre twist, two stars of the same soap were murdered 4 years apart by someone incredibly close to them. Both cases shocked the British public.
I think that these murders really resonated with people because we felt that we knew the victims personally. And if you know a murder victim, well, that's a pretty shocking thing, isn't it? I think that these murders were so brutal that actually they could not have appeared on soap operas as a storyline.
Like the character she played on screen, Gemma McCluskey was born and bred in London's East End. In October 2000, at the age of just 17, she made her first appearance in EastEnders as teenage temptress Kerry Skinner.
Watch her! You found it then? Looks like it, doesn't it? Where's birthday boy? Robbie, this is a mate I was telling you about, Kerry. You all right, gorgeous?
Minnie Stevenson is an entertainment journalist and lifelong soap fan.
Gemma McCluskey, when she rocked up as Kerry Skinner in October 2000, she was this kind of classic EastEnders character. You know, she was no shrinking violet. You could absolutely hear her before you saw her.
Come on then, let's party.
Getting into EastEnders was a dream job. It was what they would have wanted from the very beginning. They'd done it. They'd broken in to the big time.
It's a British institution. You know, at its height, 20 million people are watching. And that is the gig that no agent can buy you, really. You know, you are being watched by millions of people in Britain. You're not only being watched, but you're being invited into their home more than once a week to take part in their lives.
Gemma would go on to appear in 34 episodes of the soap. Nick Knight went to the same stage school as Gemma and recalls her fondly.
I remember Gemma as being a very bubbly, smiley, quite cheeky character. She loved a chat with her friends and stuff. And then you'd see her transform when she was performing from this quite easy, happy-go-lucky person into quite a fierce, feisty character.
But her time on Albert Square came to an end when Gemma's character was written out. Like many former soap stars, she found other acting work hard to come by.
It's definitely a tough profession, and it's very hard. It's managing expectations, and people have peaks and troughs. When you have enjoyed a lot of success, and then you hit a period when you're not being seen for work or you're not getting the work or whatever it might be, that is very, very difficult.
Now, when Gemma left EastEnders, you know, she was actually a very hard-working girl in real East End life. You know, she was working in a pub to support her family. Her mum, Pauline, was very poorly, but she was looking after her. She lived with her. She was very much a centre of her community and at the centre of her family.
After leaving Albert Square, Gemma was living in a flat in the East End. It was here she would meet her death. The 1st of March 2012 should have just been a normal day. Gemma attended the opening of the newly refurbished Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. This photograph of her at the event is the last image of her alive. That evening, she was due to do a shift in her local pub, but she didn't appear for work. She was quickly reported missing by her brothers Tony and Danny. Former Detective Inspector John Nicholson was the senior officer assigned to the case.
When somebody is reported missing, the police take an initial report, and then what happened on this occasion, they followed those subsequent inquiries, so made some checks on her telephone, checked her social media, they visited Gemma's house. It became clear to those investigating that, the local officers, that there was something more significant.
The tight-knit local community where Gemma had grown up quickly pulled together to try to find her.
The moment Gemma went missing, there was a huge campaign for her on social media, a meeting in a pub, 100 people gathering, spreading out over East London, looking for her.
There had been some photographs provided by both her brothers, printed off. Posters were then given to many of those family and friends to go and put on lamp posts and in shop windows all around the area, appealing for anybody who'd seen Gemma.
The community's efforts were taken up by Gemma's former co-stars in EastEnders. They started a Twitter campaign to appeal for information.
The EastEnders family rallied around together, particularly the women, Brooke Kinsella, Natalie Cassidy, Martine McCutcheon, all women that came forward to appeal for information when Gemma went missing, desperate to find out what had happened to one of their own.
They must have spent a lot of time with Gemma filming on EastEnders, and I think they were kind of a professional family, if you like, you know. When they started looking for her and spreading the word, that's when I sort of realised that this was quite serious, quite urgent.
Gemma McCluskey was 29 years old. She came from a close-knit East End family. Laura Richards is a criminal behaviour analyst and expert in domestic violence within families.
Gemma McCluskey was the younger sister. She had 2 older brothers. She was always the centre of attention. That's what her older brother, Danny, said, that she was always sort of looking like she was going to be an actress, always dancing, singing, very vivacious, real zest for life. But the brother, Tony, was always quieter and much more in the background.
She was close to her mum, she was close to her dad, she was close to her other brother, Danny. They were an East End family. EastEnders, East End. That's, you know, she was part of the patch. She was from the manor. You could imagine the whole family in the soap.
Gemma's parents had separated many years before, and with her mum ill in hospital, it fell to Gemma to look after her.
She was obviously a really family-orientated girl. You know, she was looking after her mum, who had a brain tumour. You know, she was doing all of these things. So she was, you know, somebody who was managing to deal without the fame and actually being very loyal and devoted to her family, a really lovely quality.
At the time of her disappearance, Gemma was sharing a flat with her brother, Tony. Their relationship had long been strained, but was now getting worse.
He wasn't particularly bright, you know, he had unskilled jobs, and actually spent most of his time smoking weed, smoking skunk. He was not highly motivated in any way.
Gemma's real life was too close to the soap in many ways because her brother Tony was hugely jealous of her success.
After Gemma's disappearance, police interviewed everyone who'd seen her on the day she went missing. After leaving the opening ceremony at the hospital, she'd gone to a friend's house for a party. Some of them reported overhearing her have a violent row on the phone with her brother, Tony.
They heard an argument going on, and when Gemma came back, she explained that earlier that day, Tony had got up, gone to the bathroom, left the taps running, and that flooded the floor, and that she'd had a blazing row with him.
Gemma decided to leave the party and return to the flat she shared with Tony to confront him. Police believed he was the last person to see her alive.
Initially, Tony was treated as a witness. Then, as the next day or so progressed, the concerns around Gemma increased. The local police went back to Tony and asked him to provide a greater explanation. He had said at that stage that he'd had an argument with Gemma earlier on that day, that she'd gone out, had come back in the early afternoon, and he'd said that he remembered and recalled her going out later on that afternoon.
CCTV footage showed Gemma returning home in her black Volkswagen Polo. Police already suspected Tony wasn't telling the truth. When they later checked cameras from the estate, there was no sign of Gemma leaving her flat. At this stage, the police were still looking for a missing person, but the investigation was about to take a gruesome turn. 5 days after she went missing, a chance discovery was made in the canal near Gemma's home.
And that's when this moved from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide investigation.
And it would take the police 6 months to crack the case and rely on another horrific twist in the tale. EastEnders stars Gemma McCluskey and Cyan Blake were both murdered 4 years apart, and both by men they loved and trusted. The lives of their on-screen characters played out in the homes of millions of viewers every week.
It's sorted. We're all meeting in the Vic in half an hour.
Soap operas are the staple TV diet for most Brits, so we feel very close to the characters because they seem to be literally in our front rooms with us.
To have two actresses from the same soap killed in horribly brutal, cold-blooded ways is just a coincidence, but it's a terrible, grisly coincidence.
In March 2012, 29-year-old Gemma McCluskey, who played Kerry Skinner in EastEnders, had been missing for 5 days. Police had already questioned her brother Tony after they were reported to have had a violent row. But the case was about to change from missing person to murder hunt. Former Detective Inspector John Nicholson led the investigation.
Member of the public navigating one of these barges came into the lock, and whilst the lock was filling up, the barge collided with a heavy object. Then, having looked over the side of the barge, she sees an open suitcase and a human torso floating on it.
The police already had a prime suspect, Gemma's brother Tony, the last person to see her alive. He was brought into an East London police station for questioning.
When Tony was a witness, he was cooperating with police and he was providing explanation as to Gemma's movements.
But after being interviewed a second time, police believed they had enough to arrest Tony McCluskey on suspicion of murdering his sister. He then decided to stop cooperating, increasing suspicion.
Although that is a legal right, if your sister is missing, if your sister's been dismembered, you would have thought, as a caring, concerned brother, he would provide an account. He chose not to.
While Gemma McCluskey had enjoyed success as an actor in EastEnders, 35-year-old brother Tony was a drug addict who'd spent years drifting in and out of employment.
He was a bit of a loner, didn't really spend much time with anybody else. He was smoking a lot of skunk. He would have about 15 joints a day and would drink excessively as well. 10 pints of lager and tequila chasers.
Sir Robin Murray is an eminent psychiatrist who studied the effects of drugs like skunk on those who use it regularly.
The more they smoked, the bigger the risk. The more potent the cannabis they were smoking, the bigger the risk. It's only when you take it consistently that it can lead to violence.
Tony McCluskey's cannabis addiction had caused huge problems in his relationship with his sister Gemma for years.
Certainly there were accounts that he was quite jealous and controlling of her, that there was sort of this underlying sense of resentment, and that he acted much more like a jealous partner than he did a brother.
It must have been difficult for McCluskey in some respects because he'd not achieved much in life. So he must have looked at her and thought, well, actually, in comparison to me, you're a star. I can't compete with that.
With Tony McCluskey still in police custody, investigators searched the flat he shared with his sister Gemma for more evidence.
We did find some minute blood droplets within the bathroom, and then in the kitchen downstairs, in the knife block, one of the kitchen knives were missing, and on one of the other knives was some blood. That blood was Gemma's blood.
6 days after Gemma was reported missing, and 24 hours after her body was found, Tony McCluskey was charged with the murder. Police were certain that Gemma had been killed in her own home. CCTV footage also showed Tony dragging a suitcase to a car.
He spends 3 hours dismembering her. He decapitates her. And not only did he do that, he cleared up. He calls a taxi. You know, this taxi driver sees him lugging, and it's caught on CCTV, this heavy suitcase, which is almost impossible to lift, and putting it in the car.
That footage would come to play a critical part in proving that Tony McCluskey was responsible for his sister's death.
So this is the canal pathway that Tony brought the suitcase along, which had contained Gemma's torso. And you'll notice some CCTV on this building here, which captured Tony walking the suitcase along this pathway. And it's clearly in here that he disposed of the suitcase containing Gemma's torso.
It's absolutely horrific, and you couldn't imagine anybody doing that to anyone else, least of all doing it to your own flesh and blood, your kith and kin, your sister, the sister who looked after you for all those years, and you'd do that to her?
After dumping his sister's body, McCluskey was desperate to conceal his involvement. He sent a text message to her phone, signing off, "Love you, kiss kiss."
That text message, the love you and kiss kiss, so we reviewed all the text messages that had been sent between Gemma and her brother during that period. And that was the one and only time that he had said love you and had put kiss marks on that. It was clearly a way of him trying to, if suspicion fell on him, to cover his tracks.
McCluskey's attempts to throw the police off his scent had failed, and he was being held on remand awaiting trial. However, investigators were still missing vital forensic evidence.
6 months into the investigation, we've got all our key evidence, forensic evidence from the flat, CCTV, forensic evidence from the boot of that car, all linking Tony to the murder. We've recovered all of Gemma's body parts, but the one crucial bit of evidence we haven't got is the recovery of Gemma's head, Gemma's skull.
Gemma's torso had been examined by a forensic pathologist, but without the entire body, it was impossible to pinpoint the exact cause of death. Without this evidence, the police were worried her brother Tony could claim in court her death was accidental. But another discovery was about to lead to a crucial breakthrough.
The inquiry team take a phone call in the major incident room to say that there are a couple of guys here. They've fished out a plastic bag, and one of them looked into the bag and sees a skull. Within a few hours, we established that that was Gemma's head. And that was really significant to us because then the forensic pathologist could give a definite cause of death, that Gemma died as a result of blunt force trauma injuries to her skull.
Now investigators believed they had everything they needed to prove that she'd been murdered by her brother, Tony McCluskey. On the 14th of January 2013, he went on trial at the Old Bailey, charged with Gemma's murder. In court, in front of the rest of Gemma's family, and faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, he finally accepted responsibility for killing her, but only admitted to manslaughter rather than murder.
What he was trying to persuade the court was that he'd had this argument with Gemma earlier on in the day, that she'd come back, that she'd then come up the stairs with a knife and attacked him, and he remembered defending himself, but that he couldn't remember anything after that. He couldn't remember assaulting her, he couldn't remember dismembering her, he couldn't remember the phone calls and the text message that he then left after that to try and disguise what he'd done.
This defence that this was red mist that he snapped is something that the facts and the evidence, for me, say otherwise. Because he's very clearly wanting to distract and mislead the police and push the focus elsewhere. This is someone with conscious choice, who's rational, who's thinking things through.
That was the case that he put to the court, and quite clearly the jury thought that he was telling lies. And of course, I was delighted to find that they didn't believe him and that he was rightly convicted of her murder.
The trial and Tony's conviction would provide little comfort to a family torn apart by one of their own.
Through this very trying time.
Gemma's dad spoke outside court on the day of the verdict.
Good night, God bless Gemma. We all miss you and love you. Thank you.
Tony wasn't just a killer and a murderer and someone who dismembered and butchered his sister. He's also a liar, a pathological liar who was prepared to stand there in court and just lie and lie and lie. He didn't want to spend the rest of his days in prison. Well, he got 20 years. He'll do at least 20 years. It'll be a long time before he's out.
With Tony McCluskey locked away, the rest of Gemma's family, including her father and brother Danny, have had to try to rebuild their lives.
To discover that your child has been killed is bad enough, but by another member of the family, her brother, it's got to have a devastating effect.
Without doubt, much as I have investigated some really gruesome homicides, this was the only time I've investigated somebody who's been dismembered. It's the only investigation I've been involved in when a brother has killed a sister.
Those who knew Gemma are left with only memories of a talented, popular girl whose future was cruelly snatched away by someone closest to her.
I think my lasting memory of Gemma off stage is of this bubbly, lively, friendly girl, and on stage of this quite fierce and formidable performer. The ending is just what it is. It's the ending. It doesn't define her as a person. She was I'm sure, a great friend to her, close friend, and a lovely actress.
Gemma McCluskey had been killed by her own brother. But just 4 years later, in a bizarre twist, another EastEnders star would also become a murder victim.
My first thought was for the boys. I was genuinely worried and concerned.
And once more, the prime suspect was someone who was supposed to love her. December 2015. Soap actress Gemma McCluskey's brother Tony had been in prison for 2 years, serving life for her murder, after dumping her body in a London canal. Later that month, another former EastEnders star, Cyan Blake, would be reported missing. A few weeks later, she would be found murdered, along with her 2 children. London-born Cyan starred in more than 50 episodes of EastEnders. Her character, Frankie Pierre, first appeared in June 1996, and she made a big impression.
Well, I'll talk to Kathy about it, but that ain't down to me. I'll have to clear it with her first.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks.
She came in, she took a fancy to Alan Jackson, who of course was going out with Carol. They're part of the Jackson family. He was stepdad to her 3 children. And she became this sort of femme fatale, temptress figure.
So how are you doing? How was your weekend?
Yeah, good. Busy. Had a lot on.
What about today? Later on?
I'm not sure.
I'll be waiting.
Cyan's performance in EastEnders was so compelling, some viewers found it hard to separate fact from fiction.
It's been nice and handy having a place in the square.
She played that character so well that actually she received death threats from people. You know, she was apparently very upset at the time that, you know, people had really believed her character to be real.
Cyan's character left Albert Square in March 1997.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go.
Excuse me, aren't you supposed to give me notice?
Oh, come on, Frankie. Thanks.
What's she looking at?
Hey, Frankie.
Just like Gemma McCluskey, after leaving EastEnders, acting roles were thin on the ground. By 2015, Cyan was living in Erith, southeast London, with her partner Arthur Simpson Kent and their two sons, Zachary aged 8 and Ammon aged 4. She was a devoted mother.
Cyan was really chatty, friendly person, absolutely lovely. If I had to describe her, it would be a fantastic mum. They were her world, she did everything for them. They were a priority.
Family was a big part of Cyan's life. A Sunday lunch at her mum's home in East London was the last time that Cyan and the boys would be seen.
My first thought was for the boys. I was genuinely worried and concerned.
Mike Sullivan is a crime reporter for The Sun, who broke the story and took special interest in the case.
Cyan was close to her family, particularly her sister Ava and her mother Pansy, and that made it all the more incomprehensible over why she would suddenly go missing.
Another worry was her failing health. Just a few days before she disappeared, Cyan had been given a devastating diagnosis. She had motor neurone disease, and it was terminal.
You can imagine somebody is in emotional turmoil at that. So when she vanishes, and she vanishes with the two children, you could think, yeah, her mind is disturbed, she's just gone to escape it all, or worse.
You have a doubly concerning situation here because you've got two children who are vulnerable because of their age, but you also have somebody who is vulnerable because of their disability. And she had motor neuron disease, and it was something that was getting worse.
3 days after last being seen, the NSPCC, alerted by Cyan's aunt, called the police with their concerns about Cyan and her children. Officers went to the family home and spoke to Cyan's partner, Arthur Simpson Kent.
Simpson Kent told them that Cyan wanted to go away because she'd been diagnosed with this terminal illness and that she wanted some time to herself and her sons.
This version of events was backed up by text messages that Cyan's family had received, seemingly from Cyan herself.
And these text messages suggested that she'd gone away because she wanted to be by herself with her sons for her last Christmas. They indicated that she'd gone to see somebody in Cambridge and that she would be away for several months. The family were immediately suspicious about the language used in the text, whether they may have been legitimately from her or not.
As well as the question marks over who was sending texts from Cyan's phone, her family were also concerned about Cyan's relationship with Arthur Simpson Kent.
Simpson Kent was a pretty nasty piece of work. He was very controlling and trying to run her life, and she was the main breadwinner in that family. She brought in the cash.
We don't know what went on behind closed doors with Cyan and Simpson Kent. We don't know to what extent she was the victim of maybe physical abuse. We know that she was controlled, and we know that he wanted to manipulate her and certainly wanted to estrange her from her family.
This wasn't the first time he displayed controlling behavior in a relationship. Arthur Simpson Kent was born in Ghana and had moved to England aged 8. As a young man, he lived and worked in London.
Arthur Simpson Kent, on the surface, was a charming man. He worked as a hairdresser, he worked as a male model, he had a succession of girlfriends, and he seemed to be a man with the world at his fingertips. But unfortunately, behind that facade, there lurked a fairly sinister side.
In 1994, whilst living in London, Simpson Kent met Dominique in a nightclub. They went on to marry and have a daughter. This is the first time she's told her story on television.
Oh, Oh, yes, of course, I fall in love, yeah. I was 20, yeah, so it was, for me, it was Charming Prince. He was very good looking, obviously, yeah. And yes, he was a very charming person.
But when the couple moved to Dominique's native France, Arthur's personality began to alter.
As soon as we moved, it changed. He started to isolate himself a lot. He was lonely. I felt him sad, really depressed. Where was the outgoing, smiling person I knew?
Arthur Simpson Kent tried to dominate his wife.
He tried to control me in a way, but I'm not somebody who, like, you can influence, really. Yeah? We were arguing all the time. Police came 3 times, and I had enough because everything was wrong.
Dominique divorced Arthur Simpson Kent in 2003. Years later, he repeated this behavior when he tried to dominate his new partner, Cyan Blake.
I would certainly call this situation a controlling and abusive relationship, that he was controlling her. Her behavior and personality had changed to the point that she became much more reclusive and was much more reserved.
In 2015, a week before Christmas, police went to Cyan's house for a second time, but Simpson Kent was nowhere to be seen. They would find out later that he'd fled the country and was on the run. Colin Sutton is a former Met Police detective with decades of experience investigating murders.
You've got a woman and her 2 children reported missing, and then the partner who said, I don't know where they are, suddenly he's missing as well. And now that becomes very suspicious.
But while suspicions were growing about Simpson Kent, the police had no leads to the whereabouts of Cyan and the boys. By late December, they'd been missing for 2 weeks. And when Cyan didn't make contact over Christmas, her family became increasingly worried that something might have happened to them.
When she didn't turn up at Christmas and see the family, they started putting more pressure on the police to say, look, this really is so out of character, we can't think that she'd have done this and still be safe.
On the 1st of January 2016, the Metropolitan Police issued a missing persons appeal, saying they were concerned for the welfare of Cyan and her sons. The press picked up on their disappearance, and it hit the headlines.
On the 2nd of January, we ran a front-page story on EastEnders actress missing with children. Now, you would have thought that someone perhaps would have come forward to say that they'd seen Cyan and her children, but there wasn't a single report. And that in itself was pretty telling, I thought.
The case escalated rapidly. It emerged that Cyan was thinking of leaving Simpson Kent and planning to go and live with her sister and mother.
We know that when a woman wants to leave an abusive relationship, this is a real trigger. It's a flashpoint for potential violence. If very serious violence is likely to occur, it's likely to occur then.
With growing fears that Simpson Kent had harmed Cyan and the boys, the murder squad then organised a full forensic search of the family home in Erith.
The bodies of Cyan and her sons were found wrapped in plastic in the garden. It's awful to think of them lying there in that grave, in their garden, the garden where those children would have played with their mother, lying there over Christmas. Cyan's family going up their minds with worry and wondering where they were. And all the time they were in the garden, dead.
With the discovery of the bodies in the back garden, Arthur Simpson Kent became the #1 suspect. Cyan's sister Ava and mum Pansy did not want to participate in this programme, but they did speak to ITV News in 2016, shortly after the bodies were found.
I always hoped that by the end of this week, even if Cyan didn't want to talk to us, we knew that she was okay. And I think we were hoping by Friday of this week we would know Unfortunately, it was much earlier than that. I've lost my sister and my 2 nephews.
Deep in shock, they couldn't comprehend Simpson Kent was responsible.
I just can't see somebody doing that. But the fact that he could kill his own 2 children is beyond belief.
But Simpson Kent was already on the run. He'd gone missing 3 days after Cyan and the boys disappeared. Police now discovered he'd left the country in December and flown to his native Ghana. Malcolm McHaffey supervises homicide cases for the Crown Prosecution Service.
It was clear that the defendant had lied to the police who'd attended and that he'd fled abroad. And that, taken together with the other circumstances, made it, so far as we were concerned, quite clear that he must have carried out those killings.
The police launched an international manhunt for Simpson Kent. But would they be able to find the man they believed was responsible for Cyan and the boys' deaths?
Their killer was still at large, and frankly could have gone anywhere had he chosen to, and police may never have found him.
January 2016. The bodies of former EastEnders star Cyan Blake and her 2 young sons had been found buried in the back garden of their home in southeast London. Now the hunt was on for Cyan's partner and the boy's father, Arthur Simpson Kent. Detectives discovered he'd left the country and flown to his native Ghana 6 days after Cyan and her sons were last seen alive.
Skipping the country is a lot easier if you're able to go somewhere where you know people. I think that's the key to it, and that's probably why he went to Ghana. And you're going to need support if you're trying to evade the law.
For Simpson Kent's ex-wife Dominique, who was living in France, news of the murders had come as a terrible shock.
It was a journalist in front of my door who just learned me that. So I was thinking like it was a joke. It involved all the family. So I was shocked, especially for the children. I couldn't even believe it.
She struggled to comprehend that her ex-husband could be responsible for 3 murders.
I didn't believe he was a murderer. I said, no, that's not possible. I knew him, I was with him. I felt sorry for the relatives, really, the family of Cyan.
Hunting for Simpson Kent in Ghana, police received tip-offs that he'd been seen near a resort on the coast.
There were certainly reports that he was partying in Ghana, chatting up women, and therefore there was no remorse shown whatsoever. This wasn't someone concerned about what he had done or wanting to take responsibility. This was someone trying to evade and avoid capture.
Simpson Kent had been in Ghana for a few weeks, actually, and he was arrested near a beach resort. He was eating a coconut. He had a decent New Year by all accounts and was, doing his best to enjoy what I think he probably knew in his heart were his last few days of freedom.
Simpson Kent returned to the UK and was charged with the triple killing. In October 2016, Arthur Simpson Kent stood trial at the Old Bailey, charged with murdering Cyan and his sons, Zachary and Ammon. He admitted killing his family, but in a final twist made another bizarre claim, insisting Cyan had wanted him to end her life because of her motor neurone disease.
Simpson Kent claimed that the idea for Cyan's death had actually come from her. He went on to build on that proposition that she'd also agreed that the children should die. Our view was that that was an utterly bizarre claim, and we didn't accept that. Far from it being anything to do with being her idea, it boiled down to the fact that Simpson Kent was a selfish and arrogant man who suffered from some sort of narcissistic disorder. And on his own version of events, lost it and became angry and carried out those vicious killings.
Simpson Kent falls into a category of killers that psychiatrists and psychologists call family annihilators. So it's a very, very small group, thankfully, of usually men who go on to kill not only their partners but also their children. There was a very obvious trigger for Simpson Kent's violence, and that was that Cyan was going to leave him.
He thinks he's about to lose her, the children, the financial aspect. She's the one that's been doing all the hard work. He just kicks back, lets her do that, lets her caretake the house, the children. But all of that is about to walk out of the door, and he's not going to allow that to happen.
Although the murder weapon was never found, post-mortem examinations revealed how Cyan and the boys had been killed.
The post-mortem revealed that there were terrible injuries, thankfully, probably extremely quick deaths, carried out by the use of repeated blunt force trauma to their heads.
And the forensic analysis of the family home revealed the lengths that Simpson Kent had gone to hide his terrible crimes.
He'd set about systematically trying to clean the property to remove evidence of his involvement and of the killings. He'd also quite clearly removed all possessions and property from the house, as well as burning some clothing and then burying the bodies under heavy flagstones in the garden, which he concealed to make it look as if the earth hadn't been disturbed. He used her phone to pretend that she was still alive in the days after her death to put off friends and family. He then took money out of her account, took a coach to Glasgow, and then fled to Ghana via Amsterdam, making every attempt to cover his tracks.
The judge at his trial handed down the toughest sentence available. Simpson Kent was given a whole life tariff for the murders.
I've dealt with a very large number of very serious cases over many years. This case stands out as being a particularly brutal and horrific killing of a mother and her 2 boys. Whilst we feel a sense of professional satisfaction at having dealt with this case, nothing can bring them back, and nothing is going to provide solace for the family.
To this day, ex-wife Dominique finds it hard to comprehend why Arthur Simpson Kent killed his whole family.
Father was there. I will just ask just one question. Why? Why? That's it. Because it was not the man I used to know. So why? What happened along the way, and why?
Today, the murderers of Cyan Blake and her EastEnders co-star Gemma McCluskey are behind bars, despite their efforts to conceal their terrible crimes.
Both of these killers have something in common. They took very calculated steps to try and get away with it. So on some level, they felt that they could do it, they could pull it off, they could get away with murder. Now, in actual fact, this isn't television, this isn't a soap opera plot, and it's very, very difficult to get away with serious crimes like that. You have to be far smarter than the police, victims' families, and forensic teams. They were never going to get away with it.
But as horrific as the murders were, those who were close to Gemma and Cyan choose to remember and celebrate their lives.
A loving, caring, doting mum. Her kids were a priority. They came first above anything else. And I think that will be what people remember about her.
When you remember someone that's died, I think the key issue is to remember the person and not the way they passed. You want to remember the fun, bubbly, kind person, and that's the image that I'm going to remember Gemma by.
Gemma McCluskey and Cyan Blake, 2 talented women who entertained millions and who were devoted to their families, murdered in cold blood by those they trusted most.
The operating theatre, minute by minute, shows you a knee replacement as it happened in real time, with Nikki Campbell tomorrow night at 11:05. Next up, Police Interceptors.